Imagine buying a human being for just 17 cents, only to discover a secret so shocking it could rewrite everything you thought you knew about their past. Today, we're diving into the unbelievable story of the widow who purchased a young slave for the price of a loaf of bread, and the hidden marriage she never expected to uncover. This isn't just history. It's a buried truth that exposes the darker side of America's past. Before we jump in, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. All right, let's get into it. 17 cents. That's what it cost to buy a human life on the morning of March 14th, 1857. The air was thick with humidity in Charleston's old slave mart, and among the hundreds of people being sold that day, one young man stood quietly in the corner, his eyes fixed on the wooden floor beneath his bare feet. His name was Samuel. He was 23 years old. And the elderly widow who purchased him for less than the price of a loaf of bread had no idea that this transaction would unravel a secret that had been buried for 7 years. This is a story about identity, about what we hide, about what we lose, and about the dangerous truth that sometimes the people we bring into our homes carry histories that can destroy everything we think we know. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore was 71 years old when she walked into that auction house. She had been widowed for 3 years, living alone in a modest townhouse on Meeting Street. Her children had married and moved to different states. Her husband's shipping business had collapsed 2 years before his death, leaving her with just enough money to maintain her home and afford one servant. She needed help. Her hands shook too much to cook. Her legs ached when she climbed stairs. The girls at the employment agencies wanted wages she couldn't afford, so she went to the auction. She arrived at 7 in the morning. The building smelled of sweat and fear and human waste. There were 43 people being sold that day, men, women, children. Some stood defiant, others wept. Eleanor walked past them slowly, her cane tapping against the floor, her eyes scanning each face. She wasn't looking for strength or youth. She was looking for something else. Something she couldn't quite name. That's when she saw him. Samuel stood apart from the others. He was thin, his clothes were rags, but there was something in the way he held himself. A quietness. A stillness. He didn't look at the buyers as they passed. He didn't plead or perform. He simply waited. There was a dignity in that waiting that Eleanor recognized. It reminded her of her late husband in the final days of his illness. The acceptance of fate without surrender. The auctioneer's voice cut through the noise. Samuel was lot number 17. Starting bid? 10 cents. Eleanor raised her hand. Another woman bid 12 cents. Eleanor bid 15. The other woman walked away. Going once, going twice. 17 cents. Sold to the widow in black. Eleanor paid with coins from her purse. The transaction took less than 3 minutes. Samuel was given a piece of paper with Eleanor's name and address. He gathered his few belongings, a blanket, a tin cup, a small leather pouch he kept tied around his neck, and followed the old woman out into the blinding sunlight of a Charleston morning. They walked in silence through the cobblestone streets. Eleanor moved slowly, her cane finding purchase on each stone. Samuel walked 3 steps behind her, as was expected. Neither spoke. The city was waking up around them. Merchants opening shops, horses pulling carts. the smell of bread baking in the bakeries along King Street. When they reached the townhouse on Meeting Street, Eleanor stopped at the front steps. She turned to look at Samuel for the first time since leaving the auction. His face was gaunt, his eyes dark and unreadable. She felt a flicker of uncertainty. What had she done? This stranger would now live in her home, sleep under her roof. She knew nothing about him, nothing at all. "Can you cook?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Samuel replied. His voice was quiet, refined. It surprised her. Most of the enslaved people she had known spoke in rough dialects, their words shaped by fieldwork and isolation. But Samuel spoke like someone who had been educated. "Can you read?" Samuel hesitated. Reading was illegal for enslaved people in South Carolina. Admitting literacy could mean punishment. But something in Eleanor's face, the weariness, the loneliness, made him take the risk. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor nodded slowly. She didn't ask how he had learned. She didn't ask where he had come from or what had happened to bring him to that auction house. She simply opened the door and said, "You'll sleep in the room off the kitchen. I'll show you where everything is." The house was small but well maintained. 2 floors, 4 rooms upstairs, 3 down. The furniture was old but elegant, remnants of better days. Samuel followed Eleanor through the narrow hallway to the kitchen. The room off to the side was barely larger than a closet. A cot, a thin mattress, a single window that looked out onto the alley. "This is yours," Eleanor said. "I'll need breakfast at 7. Something simple. I don't eat much anymore." Samuel nodded. Eleanor left him there and climbed the stairs to her bedroom, her cane tapping against each step. When she reached the top, she felt exhausted. Not from the walk, from the decision. She had bought a person, a human being, for 17 cents. The reality of it settled over her like a weight she couldn't lift. Downstairs, Samuel stood in his new room and looked around. The walls were bare. The floor was clean. Through the window he could see the back gardens of the neighboring houses. Flowers blooming. Trees swaying in the breeze. It was almost peaceful. Almost. He sat down on the cot and reached for the leather pouch around his neck. He opened it carefully and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it slowly, his hands trembling. Inside was a ring. Simple. Gold. Worn smooth by years of wearing. He held it up to the light coming through the window. Even after 7 years, it still caught the sun the same way. He could still remember the moment she had slipped it onto his finger. The weight of it. The promise it represented. A promise that had been destroyed in a single night of violence and betrayal. Samuel closed his fist around the ring and closed his eyes. He couldn't afford to remember. Not now, not yet. He had survived this long by forgetting, by becoming invisible, by letting Samuel the person disappear until only Samuel the slave remained. But now he was in this house, with this old woman who had kind eyes and a soft voice. And he didn't know if invisibility would be enough anymore. The first morning, Samuel woke before dawn. He had always been an early riser, even before everything changed. There was something about the quiet hours before sunrise that felt safe. The world was still asleep, still unaware. He could move through those hours without being seen. He dressed in the clothes Eleanor had left for him. Simple trousers, a white shirt. Better than the rags he had worn at the auction. He washed his face in the basin by the window and tied the leather pouch around his neck, tucking it beneath his shirt where it wouldn't be visible. The kitchen was dark when he entered. He lit a candle and looked around. The pantry was modest but well stocked. Flour, sugar, salt, dried beans, a small basket of eggs. He decided on something simple: biscuits, eggs, coffee. He had learned to cook in another life. Before, when he had been someone else. His wife had taught him. She had laughed at his first attempts, his burned bread and oversalted stews. But she had been patient. She had shown him how to test the heat of the oven with his hand, how to crack an egg with one hand, how to fold dough until it was light and airy. He tried not to think about her as he worked, but the memories came anyway. The way she hummed while she cooked, the flour on her cheek, the smile she gave him when he tasted her food and closed his eyes in pleasure. He pushed the memories away and focused on the task. Mix the flour, cut in the butter, add the milk, knead gently, cut circles, bake. At 7 o'clock exactly, Eleanor came down the stairs. She moved carefully, her hand gripping the railing, her cane in the other hand. Samuel heard her approach and quickly set the table. Plate, cup, napkin, fork. Eleanor entered the kitchen and stopped. The table was set perfectly. The biscuits were golden and steaming. The eggs were cooked exactly right. The coffee smelled rich and strong. She looked at Samuel, who stood by the stove, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes downcast. "You made all this?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." She sat down slowly and picked up a biscuit. She broke it open. Steam rose from the soft interior. She took a bite and closed her eyes. It was perfect. Light, buttery. Better than anything she had made herself in years. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" she asked. Samuel hesitated. "My wife taught me, ma'am." Eleanor looked up sharply. "Your wife?" Samuel realized his mistake immediately. He had revealed too much. Enslaved people weren't supposed to have wives, not legal ones, not recognized ones. Their marriages weren't real in the eyes of the law. They could be separated at any moment, sold away from each other, their vows meaningless. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "Before." Eleanor wanted to ask more, but something in Samuel's face stopped her. There was pain there. Old pain. Deep pain. She had seen that look before. In the mirror, after her husband died. "Well," she said finally, "she taught you well." Samuel nodded and returned to the stove. Eleanor ate in silence, and when she was finished, she stood and walked to the parlor to begin her day. Samuel cleared the table and washed the dishes. The routine had begun. The days fell into a pattern. Samuel woke early, prepared breakfast, cleaned the house, made lunch, tended the small garden behind the house, prepared dinner, cleaned again. At night, he returned to his small room and lay in the cot, staring at the ceiling, trying not to remember. Eleanor watched him work. He was efficient, quiet, thorough. The house had never been cleaner. The meals had never been better. But there was something about him that troubled her. He never smiled, never spoke unless spoken to, never asked for anything. It was as if he was trying to disappear into the walls themselves. On the third day, Eleanor found him in the garden. He was kneeling beside the tomato plants, his hands in the soil, his face tilted toward the sun. For a moment he looked peaceful, almost happy. Then he noticed her watching, and the expression vanished, replaced by the blank mask he wore inside the house. "You know about gardens," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am, a little." "What else do you know about?" Samuel paused. This was dangerous territory. The more he revealed about himself, the more questions she would ask. And questions led to truth. And truth was the one thing he couldn't afford. "I can read, ma'am. You already know that. I can write. I know numbers. I can repair things. Carpentry. A little metal work? Eleanor frowned. That's quite an education for... She stopped herself. For a slave? Samuel finished quietly. Eleanor felt her face flush. I didn't mean... I know what you meant, ma'am. There was no anger in his voice, only weariness. I wasn't always this. Eleanor stood there, her hand gripping her cane, wanting to ask but afraid of the answer. Finally, she said, Will you teach me about the garden? I used to love gardening, but my hands don't work like they used to. Samuel looked up at her. For the first time since arriving, he met her eyes directly. Yes, ma'am, I can do that. And so they began to spend time in the garden together. Eleanor would sit on a wooden chair Samuel brought out for her, and he would show her which plants needed water, which needed pruning, which were ready to harvest. She would tell him stories about her husband, about the garden they had kept together when they were younger, about the roses she had grown that won a prize at the county fair in 1823. Samuel listened. He didn't share his own stories, but he listened. And slowly, carefully, something began to shift between them. Not quite friendship. Not yet. But something closer to it than either had expected. On the 7th day, Eleanor made a decision. She was sitting in her parlor after dinner reading by candlelight when she called for Samuel. He appeared in the doorway, his hands still damp from washing dishes. Yes, ma'am? Come sit down, Eleanor said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Samuel hesitated. Enslaved people didn't sit with their owners. It wasn't done. It wasn't allowed. Please, Eleanor said. I want to talk to you. Samuel entered slowly and sat on the edge of the chair, his back straight, his hands folded in his lap. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. In the candlelight, his face looked younger than she had thought. There were lines around his eyes, but they were the lines of worry, not age. I want you to know something, Eleanor said finally. I didn't buy you because I wanted a slave. I bought you because I was alone. Because I was afraid. Because I couldn't afford anything else. She paused. That doesn't make it right. I know that. But I want you to understand that I see you. I see that you're a person. A man. Not property. Samuel said nothing. He had heard words like this before, from owners who wanted to feel better about themselves. Words were cheap. Actions mattered. I know you don't believe me, Eleanor continued, and I don't blame you, but I'm going to prove it to you. Starting now, you'll take your meals with me, at the table, like a person. Samuel's eyes widened slightly. Ma'am, I don't care what people think, Eleanor interrupted. This is my house, and you'll eat at my table. Samuel stared at her. This old woman with her kind eyes and her trembling hands and her foolish ideals. She had no idea what she was risking. People would talk. They would judge her. They might even report her for treating a slave too kindly. There were laws against that in some places. But he also saw something else in her face. Loneliness. The same loneliness that kept him awake at night. The same loneliness that made him reach for the ring around his neck and remember what it felt like to be loved. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. If that's what you want. It is, Eleanor said firmly. Now go to bed. You've worked hard today. Samuel stood and left the room. When he reached his small room off the kitchen, he sat on the cot and pulled out the ring. He held it in his palm and whispered a name he hadn't spoken aloud in 7 years. Mary. The name hung in the air like a prayer, like a curse. He closed his fist around the ring and lay back on the cot. Outside, the night was full of sounds. Crickets, a dog barking in the distance, the wind in the trees. And Samuel lay there, the ring pressed against his chest, and wondered how long he could keep his secret buried before it destroyed everything. 3 weeks passed. Samuel and Eleanor fell into a comfortable rhythm. They ate breakfast together. She would read the newspaper aloud while he listened and poured coffee. They worked in the garden together. She would point out which plants needed attention, and he would carefully tend to them while she watched and offered advice. They ate dinner together. She would tell stories about her youth, and he would occasionally share small, carefully chosen details about his own past. Nothing important, nothing revealing. Just enough to seem human. But Eleanor was observant. She noticed things. The way Samuel's hand would sometimes reach for the leather pouch around his neck when he thought she wasn't looking. The way he grew quiet when she mentioned marriages or family. The way he stared out the kitchen window sometimes, his eyes focused on something far away, something only he could see. One morning in early April, Eleanor was going through papers in her late husband's study. She rarely entered this room anymore. It was too full of memories. His desk, his books, his pipe still sitting in the ashtray where he had left it the day he died. But the tax collector had sent a notice, and she needed to find documents related to the house. She was searching through the desk drawers when she found a stack of old letters. They were tied with a faded ribbon, and when she pulled them out, dust rose into the air. She recognized her husband's handwriting on the envelopes. Letters he had written but never sent. She untied the ribbon and began to read. Most were business correspondence. Letters to clients he had never finished. Letters to partners in failed ventures. But near the bottom of the stack, she found something different. A letter addressed to someone named Thomas in Baltimore. She opened it carefully. The letter was dated 1849, 8 years ago. Her husband wrote about a shipping contract he had taken. Moving cargo from Virginia to Charleston. He mentioned that the cargo included human property and that he had been troubled by it. He wrote that one of the enslaved people being transported had tried to escape in Richmond. There had been violence. Someone had been killed. The letter ended abruptly, unfinished. Eleanor felt cold. She had known her husband's business involved the slave trade peripherally. Many businesses did. But she had never wanted to know the details. She had turned away from that part of his life. Now, holding this letter, she couldn't turn away anymore. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the drawer, but the words stayed with her. Violence. Richmond, 1849. She tried to push them out of her mind. They had nothing to do with Samuel, nothing to do with her current life. But that night at dinner, she looked at Samuel differently. He was cutting his food carefully, his movements precise and controlled. There was something almost military about the way he held himself. Straight back, level shoulders, eyes forward. Where had he learned that? "Samuel," she said suddenly, "where were you before the auction?" Samuel's hand froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly. "I was in a work gang, ma'am, in Georgia. Before that, different places." "How long were you in Georgia?" 2 years, ma'am." "And before that?" Samuel felt his pulse quicken. These were the questions he had been dreading. The questions that led to places he couldn't go. "I'd rather not talk about before, ma'am, if that's all right." Eleanor saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened. She should have stopped. She should have respected his privacy. But the letter had unsettled her, and she needed to know. "Were you in Richmond?" she asked. "In 1849? The color drained from Samuel's face. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm not feeling well." He left the room before Eleanor could respond. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, the door to his room closing. She sat alone at the table, her dinner growing cold, and felt a heavy dread settle in her stomach. She had touched something. Something painful. Something dangerous. Upstairs, Samuel sat on his cot, his head in his hands. Richmond. 1849. The words echoed in his mind like a death sentence. How did she know? What had she heard? He needed to be more careful. He needed to remember that no matter how kind she seemed, he was still property. Still powerless, still at risk. He pulled out the ring and held it tightly. Mary would have known what to do. Mary had always been smarter than him, braver. She would have found a way to navigate this. But Mary was gone. Had been gone for 7 years. And he was alone. The next morning, Samuel made breakfast as usual. But when Eleanor came downstairs, he didn't meet her eyes. He set the plate in front of her and stepped back, waiting. "Samuel," Eleanor said gently, "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have pried. Your past is your own." Samuel nodded but said nothing. "Please," Eleanor continued, "sit down, eat with me." Samuel hesitated, then sat. They ate in silence. The ease that had developed between them over the past weeks was gone, replaced by careful distance. Eleanor hated it. She hated that she had caused it, but she didn't know how to fix it. After breakfast, Samuel cleared the table and went outside to work in the garden. Eleanor watched from the window. He moved mechanically, pulling weeds, watering plants. There was no peace in it today, no moment of stillness, just work, just survival. Eleanor made a decision. She went to her husband's study and retrieved the unfinished letter. She read it again, more carefully this time. Her husband wrote about a man named Samuel, a man who had been educated, who spoke well, who had tried to escape, who had been married to someone named Mary. Eleanor felt her breath catch. It couldn't be. It was impossible. There were thousands of men named Samuel, thousands of stories like this, but the details, the education, the marriage, Richmond, 1849. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket. She needed to know the truth, but she couldn't ask directly. Samuel had already shut down once. If she pushed too hard, he might run. Or worse, he might retreat so far into himself that she would never reach him again. She needed to be patient. She needed to wait for him to trust her. And in the meantime, she needed to learn everything she could about what had happened in Richmond in 1849. That afternoon, Eleanor did something she hadn't done in years. She put on her best dress, took her cane, and walked to the Charleston Library Society. The building was elegant, full of books and newspapers and records. She approached the librarian, an elderly man named Mr. Thornton, who had known her husband. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said warmly. "What a pleasant surprise. How can I help you?" "I'm looking for newspaper archives," Eleanor said. "From Richmond, from 1849. Mr. Thornton raised an eyebrow. "Richmond? That's quite specific. What are you researching?" "A personal matter," Eleanor said carefully. "Do you have those records?" "We have some," Mr. Thornton said. "Let me see what I can find." He disappeared into the back rooms and returned 20 minutes later with a stack of bound newspapers. "These are from the Richmond Enquirer, 1849. Is there a particular month you're interested in?" Eleanor thought back to her husband's letter. He had dated it October 1849. "September or October," she said. Mr. Thornton pulled out 2 volumes and handed them to her. "You can read them at that table by the window. Take your time." Eleanor carried the heavy volumes to the table and began to search. She went through page after page, advertisements, political news, society announcements. And then, in the October 12th edition, she found it. The headline read, "Violent Escape Attempt Ends in Tragedy." The article described an incident at a Richmond warehouse where enslaved people were being held for transport. A group of 5 men had attempted to escape. There had been a confrontation. One of the warehouse guards had been killed. 2 of the men had been captured and executed. 3 had escaped into the night and were still at large. The article listed names. The executed men were named Peter and James. The escaped men were named Samuel, Thomas, and Isaac. And then, a detail that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Samuel, age 23, literate, was reportedly married to a woman named Mary who was sold separately 2 weeks prior to the escape attempt. Eleanor closed the newspaper carefully. Her hands were shaking. It was him. It had to be him. The Samuel she had bought for 17 cents had been one of the escaped men. He had killed a guard. He had been on the run for 7 years, and she had brought him into her home. She looked around the library. Mr. Thornton was helping another patron. No one was watching her. She stood slowly, gathered her things, and left. She walked home through the afternoon heat, her mind racing. What should she do? Report him? He was a wanted man. A murderer. But was he? The article said there had been a confrontation. It didn't say who had killed the guard. It could have been any of the 5 men. And even if it was Samuel, what choice had he had? He was trying to escape slavery, trying to find his wife. By the time Eleanor reached home, she had made a decision. She wouldn't report him. She wouldn't even confront him. Not yet. She would wait. She would watch. She would try to understand what kind of man he really was. When she entered the house, Samuel was in the kitchen preparing dinner. He looked up when she came in, his face carefully neutral. "Good evening, ma'am," he said quietly. "Good evening, Samuel," Eleanor replied. She hung up her shawl and walked past him to the parlor. She sat in her chair and stared at the wall, the weight of what she knew pressing down on her. In the kitchen, Samuel continued cooking, but his hands trembled slightly as he stirred the pot. He had seen the way Eleanor looked at him when she came in. Something had changed. Something had shifted. He didn't know what, but he knew that whatever safety he had found in this house was fragile, and it could shatter at any moment. That night, after dinner, Eleanor excused herself early and went to bed. Samuel cleaned the kitchen and returned to his room. He pulled out the ring and held it up to the candlelight. "Mary?" he whispered. "I'm sorry, I tried to find you, but it's been too long. You're probably gone, and I'm probably going to die here without ever seeing you again." The ring gleamed in the flickering light, and Samuel closed his eyes and let himself remember the last time he had seen his wife. The warehouse in Richmond, the chains, her screams as they dragged her away, his own screams, the desperate, failed attempt to save her. He had failed then, and he was failing now. But he didn't know what else to do. So he held the ring. And he remembered. And he waited for whatever would come next. Sleep didn't come easily to Eleanor that night. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the man sleeping downstairs. Samuel, the escaped slave, the possible murderer? The gentleman who made perfect biscuits and tended her garden with careful hands. Which one was real? Could both be true at once? In the morning, she found him already working in the kitchen. He had dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't slept well either. They ate breakfast in near silence. The ease between them was gone, replaced by something heavy and unspoken. After breakfast, Eleanor made an excuse about needing to rest and retreated to her husband's study. She needed to know more. The newspaper article had given her basic facts, but it hadn't told her the whole story. She needed to understand what had happened. Not just the facts, the truth. She spent the morning going through her husband's papers more carefully. She found ledgers from his shipping business, records of cargo, and there, buried in the accounts from 1849, she found entries that made her stomach turn. Human cargo, 23 adults, 7 children, transported from Richmond to Charleston. Payment received, $4,200. Her husband had been directly involved. He hadn't just peripherally benefited from slavery. He had transported enslaved people, had profited from their suffering. She had known this intellectually, but seeing it written in his careful handwriting made it real in a way it hadn't been before. She kept searching, and then she found something that changed everything. A small daguerreotype photograph, no larger than her palm, tucked into the back of one of the ledgers. She pulled it out carefully and held it up to the light. The image showed a group of people standing in front of a warehouse. Enslaved people waiting to be transported. The photograph was faded, the faces difficult to make out. But in the back row, she could see a young man, tall, thin, standing with careful posture. Next to him was a woman. Even in the blurred image, Eleanor could see they were holding hands. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in her husband's handwriting, were 2 words: Samuel and Mary. Eleanor felt tears well in her eyes. This was proof. Proof that Samuel had been there. Proof that he had been married. Proof that they had been separated. The photograph made them real. Not just names in a newspaper article. Not just entries in a ledger. Real people. With faces, with love, with loss. She stared at the image for a long time. The woman, Mary, was beautiful even in the faded photograph. She had a round face, kind eyes, a gentle smile. She was looking at Samuel, not at the camera, and Samuel was looking at her the same way. Even facing transportation, even facing separation, they had that moment. That connection. Eleanor carefully tucked the photograph into her pocket and left the study. She found Samuel in the garden, kneeling by the vegetables. She approached slowly, her cane tapping against the stone path. "Samuel," she said softly. He looked up and she saw the wariness in his eyes. He knew something was coming. He had been waiting for it. "I need to show you something," Eleanor said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the photograph. "I found this in my husband's papers." Samuel's face went white. He stared at the image, his hands frozen in the soil. For a moment, he didn't breathe. Then he reached out with trembling fingers and took the photograph from Eleanor's hand. He held it close, his eyes moving over every detail. The warehouse. The other people. Mary. Himself. Young. Hopeful. Still believing they would survive this together. He traced Mary's face with his finger, leaving a small smudge of dirt on the surface. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. "My husband took it," Eleanor said quietly. "Before the transport. I think he documented all his shipments." Samuel looked up at her, and for the first time, Eleanor saw raw emotion in his face. Pain. Anger. Grief. "Your husband separated us," he said, his voice shaking. "He promised we would stay together. He promised. And then, 2 weeks before the transport, he sold Mary separately. He lied to us." Eleanor felt her own eyes fill with tears. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry, I didn't know the details until yesterday, but I know now." and I'm so, so sorry. Samuel stood up, still clutching the photograph. You want to know what happened in Richmond? He said, his voice rising. You want to know the truth? I'll tell you. We were chained in that warehouse for 3 weeks, 23 adults, 7 children, waiting to be shipped like cattle, and every night I could hear Mary crying in the women's section. I couldn't reach her, couldn't comfort her, couldn't do anything. His hands were shaking now, the photograph trembling. Then one night they came and took her, dragged her out. She screamed my name. She screamed and screamed, and I broke free from my chains. I wasn't the only one. 4 other men broke free. We tried to stop them, tried to save our families. And there was a fight. Someone grabbed a guard's rifle. There was a struggle. The gun went off. The guard fell. Samuel's voice broke. I don't know who fired the shot. It could have been any of us. It could have been the guard himself. But he died, and we ran. Peter and James were caught the next day. They were hanged. Thomas, Isaac, and I made it out. We split up. I never saw them again. And I never found Mary. I looked. For months I looked, but she was gone. He sank to his knees, still holding the photograph, tears streaming down his face. I've been running for 7 years. 7 years. And I've carried this ring with me every day, hoping that somehow, someday I would find her. But she's gone. She's gone. And I couldn't save her. Eleanor knelt beside him, ignoring the pain in her legs. She put her hand on his shoulder. You did everything you could, she said gently. You fought for her. You tried to save her. That's what love is. Samuel shook his head. It wasn't enough. It's never enough. They stayed like that for a long time. The old woman and the young man, kneeling in the garden together, sharing grief. When Samuel finally stood, he carefully folded the photograph and held it out to Eleanor. Keep it, Eleanor said. It's yours. She's yours. Samuel looked at her, confusion in his eyes. Why are you being kind to me? He asked. You know what I am now, what I've done. You could turn me in. You should turn me in. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Because I understand loss, she said. Because I know what it's like to love someone and lose them. And because you're not what the world says you are. You're a man who loved his wife. That's all that matters to me. Samuel felt something break inside him. The wall he had built around himself. The armor he had worn for 7 years. It cracked. And behind it was just a man. Tired, broken, grieving, but still human. Still capable of feeling. Thank you, he whispered. Eleanor squeezed his shoulder and then stood, using her cane for support. Come inside when you're ready, she said. We'll have lunch together, and then I'll tell you what we're going to do. Samuel watched her walk away, the photograph clutched in his hand. For the first time in 7 years, he felt something he had thought was dead. Hope. Fragile, terrifying, but real. Inside, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and made a plan. She couldn't undo what had been done, couldn't bring Mary back, couldn't erase the past. But she could help Samuel now. She could give him safety, information, maybe even a chance at finding peace. When Samuel came inside, his eyes were red, but his face was composed. He sat down at the table across from Eleanor. She poured him tea and slid the cup across to him. I've been thinking, Eleanor said, about what to do next, about how to help you. Samuel wrapped his hands around the warm cup. You've already done more than I expected, more than I deserved. Stop that, Eleanor said firmly. You deserve everything. You deserve freedom. You deserve to find out what happened to Mary. You deserve peace. Samuel looked up at her. Those are beautiful words, but you can't give me those things. No one can. Maybe not all of them, Eleanor admitted, but I can try to give you answers. My husband kept detailed records of all his transactions. If Mary was sold through his company, there will be documentation. A bill of sale. A destination. Something. Samuel's grip on the cup tightened. You would do that? Risk looking into those records? If anyone found out... No one will find out, Eleanor interrupted. Those records are in my house. They're private. And I'm going to go through every single one until I find information about Mary. For the first time since the garden, Samuel allowed himself to feel something close to hope. When can we start? Now, Eleanor said. She stood and gestured for him to follow her to the study. The study was dusty and dim, even with the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. Eleanor lit several candles and began pulling out ledgers from the shelves. There were dozens of them. Years of transactions. Hundreds of lives reduced to entries in a bookkeeper's careful hand. Samuel stood in the doorway, reluctant to enter. This room represented everything he hated, everything that had destroyed his life, but it also might hold the key to finding Mary. So he stepped inside. Eleanor spread the ledgers across the desk. These are organized by year, she explained. The transaction would have happened in September 1849. We'll start there. They sat side by side and began searching. Eleanor ran her finger down columns of names, dates, prices. Samuel watched, his breathing shallow. Every name was a person. Every price was a life bought and sold. It made him feel sick. Here, Eleanor said suddenly. September 18th, 1849. Mary, female, age 21, sold to Henderson & Sons, Savannah, Georgia. Price, $850. Samuel felt the room tilt. Savannah. Mary had been taken to Savannah. He repeated the name silently. Henderson & Sons. After 7 years of not knowing, he finally had a destination. A starting point. Is there more? He asked, his voice hoarse. Eleanor continued reading. The notation says she was purchased for domestic work. House servant. That's all it says here. Samuel closed his eyes. Domestic work? That could mean anything. It could mean she had been treated well, given light duties. Or it could mean something much worse. He had heard stories about what happened to young women sold for domestic work. He pushed those thoughts away. He couldn't afford to think about that now. Henderson & Sons, he repeated. Do you know them? Eleanor shook her head. The name is familiar, but I don't know details. They were a large firm. They dealt in tobacco, cotton, and... She trailed off. And enslaved people, Samuel finished. Yes. Samuel stood and walked to the window. Savannah was 100 miles away. It might as well have been 1,000. He had no money, no papers, no freedom to travel. Even if he could get there, what would he find? Mary could be anywhere by now. She could have been sold again. Could have been moved to a plantation. Could have died. The thought made his chest tighten. He pulled the ring from beneath his shirt and held it in his palm. The weight of it was familiar, comforting. He had carried it for so long that it had become part of him. We'll find out more, Eleanor said from behind him. I still have some connections in Savannah. People who owed my husband favors. I can write to them, ask questions discreetly. Samuel turned to face her. Why are you doing this? You could get in serious trouble. If anyone finds out you're helping me... I'm a 71-year-old widow, Eleanor interrupted. I'm not afraid of gossip. And I'm certainly not afraid of helping someone find the person they love. Samuel felt emotion rise in his throat. He swallowed it down. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Eleanor replied. Just help me write these letters. They spent the rest of the afternoon composing correspondence. Eleanor dictated while Samuel wrote. His handwriting was clear and elegant, another remnant of his previous life. They crafted careful inquiries to 3 different contacts in Savannah. Business associates of Eleanor's late husband. People who might have information about Henderson and Sons and their transactions from 1849. The letters are deliberately vague. Eleanor claimed she was settling her husband's estate and needed information about old business dealings. She never mentioned Samuel, never mentioned Mary by name, but she included enough details, dates, approximate ages, descriptions, that someone with access to records might be able to trace what had happened. When the letters were finished, Eleanor sealed them with wax and set them aside to be posted in the morning. Now we wait, she said. How long? Samuel asked. A few weeks, probably, maybe longer. Mail from Savannah isn't quick. Samuel nodded. Weeks. After 7 years, a few weeks should feel like nothing. But now that he had a thread to follow, the waiting felt unbearable. That evening, they ate dinner in contemplative silence. The revelation of the day hung between them. Samuel kept touching his pocket where he had placed the photograph. Mary's face. Young and hopeful. He tried to imagine what she looked like now. If she looked like anything. If she was even still alive. Tell me about her, Eleanor said suddenly. Samuel looked up from his plate. What? Mary, tell me about her. Not about what happened to her. About who she was. Samuel hesitated. He hadn't spoken about Mary to anyone in years. It was too painful. But looking at Eleanor's kind face, he found himself wanting to share. To make Mary real again, if only in words. She was fierce, he began slowly. Everyone always commented on how gentle she looked, how sweet. But she was fierce. When the overseer tried to separate a mother from her children, Mary stood between them and refused to move. She was whipped for that. 15 lashes. And the next day she did it again. Eleanor listened, her eyes fixed on Samuel's face. She could read, too, Samuel continued. Better than me. She taught herself using a Bible someone had left in the chapel. She would memorize passages and recite them to the other women. She said if they took everything else from us, they couldn't take what was in our minds. How did you meet? At a church gathering. The plantation owner was religious, so he let us attend services on Sundays. I saw her across the room, and I knew, just knew. That sounds foolish, doesn't it? No, Eleanor said softly. It sounds like love. Samuel smiled, a sad, distant expression. We were married 6 months later. Not legally, of course, but we spoke vows in front of everyone. Promised ourselves to each other. She wore flowers in her hair. White daisies. I can still see them. He paused, his voice catching. We had 2 years together? 2 years. We talked about running away. Finding freedom, having children, building a life. But we were afraid. We had heard the stories about what happened to runaways who were caught. So we waited. We told ourselves we would find the right moment, the right opportunity. And then the owner died. His son took over and immediately started selling people off to pay debts. Mary and I were separated, put in different holding pens. That's when we ended up in Richmond, in your husband's warehouse. And you know the rest. Eleanor reached across the table and took Samuel's hand. "We'll find out what happened to her. I promise you that. Even if the news is hard to hear, you deserve to know." Samuel nodded. He appreciated the promise, even though he knew Eleanor couldn't control the outcome. But the effort mattered. Someone was finally trying to help him. After 7 years of being invisible, someone finally saw him. That night, Samuel lay on his cot with the photograph propped against the wall where he could see it in the moonlight. Mary's face looked peaceful in the image, unaware of what was coming. He wondered if she had ever thought about him over the years, if she had kept hope alive or if she had moved on. He didn't know which possibility hurt more. The ring around his neck felt heavier than usual. He pulled it out and held it up, watching it catch the faint light. "I'm trying, Mary," he whispered to the darkness. "I'm still trying." The next few weeks were excruciating. Every morning, Samuel asked if the mail had arrived. Every evening, Eleanor checked and shook her head. No responses yet. Too soon. Be patient. But patience was difficult when every day felt like it might bring an answer. Samuel threw himself into work to distract himself. He repaired the fence in the garden. He fixed the loose shutter on the upstairs window. He scrubbed the kitchen floor until it gleamed. Eleanor watched him work himself to exhaustion every night, but she didn't try to stop him. She understood. Work was better than thinking. During meals, they talked more. Eleanor shared stories about her marriage, the good years and the difficult ones. Samuel shared memories of his childhood, carefully edited to avoid revealing too much. They were building something. Not quite a friendship between equals. That wasn't possible given their circumstances, but something closer to it than either had expected. One afternoon, 3 weeks after they had sent the letters, Eleanor was reading in the parlor when there was a knock at the door. Samuel was in the kitchen and heard it too. They exchanged glances. Visitors were rare. Eleanor answered the door to find a young man in a postal uniform. "Letter for Mrs. Whitmore," he said, handing her an envelope. "From Savannah." Eleanor's heart jumped. She thanked the young man and closed the door. Samuel appeared in the hallway, his face tense with hope and fear. "Is it?" "From Savannah," Eleanor confirmed. She turned the envelope over in her hands. The return address read, Morrison and Associates Legal Services. They went to the study and Eleanor carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper written in neat, professional script. She began to read aloud. "Dear Mrs. Whitmore, I received your inquiry regarding Henderson and Sons and their business transactions from 1849. I regret to inform you that Henderson and Sons dissolved their partnership in 1853, following the death of the senior Mr. Henderson. Many of their records were lost in a warehouse fire that same year. However, I was able to locate some information through secondary sources. According to the records of the Chatham County Courthouse, a woman matching the description in your letter was sold by Henderson and Sons in December 1849 to a Mr. Nathaniel Blackwood of Richmond County, Georgia. Mr. Blackwood operated a cotton plantation called Fairhope. I hope this information is helpful to your estate settlement. Please do not hesitate to contact me if you require further assistance. Yours respectfully, Charles Morrison, Esquire." Eleanor lowered the letter. Samuel stood frozen, his face unreadable. "Fairhope," he said finally. "Richmond County." Eleanor quickly consulted a map she kept in the study. "Richmond County is near Augusta," she said, "about 150 miles inland from here." Samuel turned away from her, his shoulders rigid. She was moved again. 3 months after being sold to Savannah. 3 months. But we have a name, Eleanor said gently. Nathaniel Blackwood, Fairhope Plantation. That's more than we had before. Samuel turned back to face her. What good does it do? I can't travel to Augusta. I can't walk up to a plantation and ask about an enslaved woman from 15 years ago. They would capture me. Or kill me. Eleanor set the letter on the desk. You're right. You can't, but I can. Samuel stared at her. What? I can travel, Eleanor said, her mind already working through possibilities. I'm a widow settling my late husband's affairs. I can claim I'm researching his old business connections. I can visit this Fairhope plantation and ask questions. It's too dangerous, Samuel protested. If they suspect anything... They won't, Eleanor interrupted. I'm a harmless old woman. I'll say I'm verifying records for legal purposes. They'll never suspect my real reason. Samuel shook his head. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, I'm offering. Eleanor moved closer to him. Samuel, listen to me. I'm 71 years old. I've lived my life. I've had love, marriage, children. You've had none of those things stolen from you. If I can help you get even one answer, even one moment of closure, then I'm going to do it. Samuel felt tears well in his eyes. I don't deserve this. Stop saying that, Eleanor said firmly. You deserve everything, and I'm going to help you get it. Over the next few days, Eleanor made preparations. She wrote to a distant cousin in Augusta, informing them she would be visiting. She arranged for a neighbor to check on the house while she was gone. She purchased tickets for the stagecoach that would take her inland. Samuel was torn between hope and terror. Hope that Eleanor might find answers. Terror that those answers would be unbearable. The night before Eleanor's departure, they sat together in the parlor. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, rain pattered against the windows. What will you do if you find her? Eleanor asked. Samuel had been thinking about this question for weeks. I don't know, he admitted. If she's there, if she's alive, I can't just take her. I can't free her. I have no money, no power, no legal standing. But you'll know, Eleanor said. You'll know she exists. You'll know where she is. That's something. Is it? Samuel asked. Or is it worse? Knowing she's alive but being unable to reach her? Eleanor didn't have an answer for that. They sat in silence, both contemplating the impossible situation. Finally, Eleanor spoke. I've written something, she said. A document. It's in my desk in a sealed envelope. If something happens to me, if I don't return from this journey, you're to take it to a lawyer named Thomas Prescott. His address is on the envelope. The document gives you your freedom. Legally. Samuel's eyes widened. Eleanor, you can't... I already did, she said. The document is signed and witnessed. If I die, you're free. You can leave Charleston. You can start over somewhere safe. What about your children, your family? Won't they contest it? Eleanor smiled sadly. My children haven't visited me in 3 years. They're busy with their own lives. They won't care what happens to one enslaved man. Samuel stood and walked to the window. He watched the rain slide down the glass. You've given me more than I ever expected, he said quietly. More than I knew how to hope for. Then don't waste it, Eleanor replied. Whatever happens, whatever we find out about Mary, promise me you'll keep living. Promise me you won't let grief destroy you. Samuel turned to face her. I promise to try. That was all Eleanor could ask for. The next morning, Samuel helped Eleanor into the hired carriage that would take her to the stagecoach station. She looked small and frail in her black traveling dress, her cane across her lap. He wanted to beg her not to go, wanted to tell her it wasn't worth the risk, but he also needed her to go. Needed to know. "I'll be back in 2 weeks," Eleanor said. 3 at most. Take care of the house. Take care of yourself. "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said. Eleanor reached out and squeezed his hand. "I'll find answers, Samuel. Whatever they are, I'll find them." The carriage pulled away. Samuel stood in the street and watched until it disappeared around the corner. Then he returned to the empty house and waited. It was all he could do. Eleanor's journey to Augusta took 3 days. The stagecoach was uncomfortable, jolting over rough roads, stopping at dingy inns where the beds were hard and the food barely edible. Her legs ached, her back protested, but she pushed forward. She arrived in Augusta on a Thursday afternoon. Her cousin, a woman named Judith, who she hadn't seen in 15 years, met her at the coaching station. "Eleanor!" Judith exclaimed, embracing her. "You look exhausted. Come, I've prepared a room for you." Judith's home was comfortable, and Eleanor appreciated the hospitality, but she was anxious to begin her real work. That evening, over dinner, she carefully broached the subject. "I need to visit a plantation called Fairhope," Eleanor said. "It's owned by a Mr. Nathaniel Blackwood. Do you know of it?" Judith frowned. "Fairhope? Yes, I know it. It's about 10 miles south of here. Large cotton operation. Why do you need to go there?" Eleanor had prepared her story. "I'm settling my late husband's estate. There were some business transactions with Mr. Blackwood years ago. I need to verify certain records." Judith looked skeptical but didn't press. "I can arrange for a driver to take you. Though I warn you, Nathaniel Blackwood is difficult. He's not known for his hospitality." "I just need a few minutes of his time," Eleanor assured her. 2 days later, Eleanor sat in a hired carriage as it rolled up the long drive to Fairhope Plantation. The house was impressive. White columns, wide veranda, manicured gardens. But there was something oppressive about it, too. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe it was knowing what this place represented. A house servant, an older man with gray hair, answered the door when Eleanor knocked. She gave her name and requested a few minutes with Mr. Blackwood. The servant disappeared inside and returned a few minutes later. "Mr. Blackwood will see you in the study," he said. Eleanor followed him through the elegant house. The floors were polished. The furniture was expensive. Everything spoke of wealth built on suffering. She tried to keep her face neutral. Nathaniel Blackwood was a large man in his 50s with a florid face and cold eyes. He didn't stand when Eleanor entered, merely gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Mrs. Whitmore, is it?" he said. "My man says you have questions about business dealings." "Yes, sir," Eleanor said, sitting carefully. "My late husband, Thomas Whitmore, was a shipping merchant in Charleston. I'm settling his estate, and I've found records of a transaction between your plantation and a firm called Henderson and Sons in 1849. I'm trying to verify the details." Blackwood frowned. 1849? That's 16 years ago. I barely remember what I had for breakfast, much less business from that long ago. "The transaction involved the purchase of several enslaved people," Eleanor continued, "including a young woman named Mary. I'm trying to trace what happened to her for legal purposes." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Why would you need to trace a slave? What legal purpose could that serve?" Eleanor had anticipated this question. There's a disputed inheritance claim. A distant relative of my husband's is claiming Mary was improperly sold, and my husband owes compensation. I need to prove the transaction was legitimate and that Mary was properly transferred to your ownership. It was a lie, but it was plausible. Blackwood seemed to consider it. Finally, he stood and walked to a cabinet. He pulled out a large ledger and brought it back to the desk. I keep records of all purchases, he said, flipping through pages. Let's see. 1849. December, here. Mary, female, age 21, purchased from Henderson & Sons for $850. Light field work and domestic duties. Eleanor's heart raced. Is she still here? Blackwood looked up sharply. Why do you need to know that? For the legal claim, Eleanor said quickly. If she's still in your possession, it strengthens my husband's estate's position. Blackwood studied her for a long moment. Eleanor felt sweat trickle down her back, despite the relatively cool room. Finally, he spoke. She was here until 1852, then I sold her. Eleanor felt her stomach drop. Sold her? To whom? A planter named Robert Dillard. He had a place about 30 miles from here. Needed house staff. Do you have documentation of the sale? Blackwood flipped more pages. Here, Mary sold to Robert Dillard, October 1852 for $100. Eleanor committed the name to memory. Robert Dillard, 30 miles from here. Is Mr. Dillard's plantation still operating? Far as I know, Blackwood said, closing the ledger. Place called Riverside, on the Savannah River. Now, is there anything else? I'm a busy man. No, that's all I needed, Eleanor said, standing. Thank you for your time. Blackwood nodded curtly and rang for the servant to show her out. As Eleanor walked back to the carriage, her mind was racing. Mary had been moved again. From Charleston to Savannah to Fairhope to Riverside. 4 different places in the span of 3 years. But the trail was still warm. She was sold in 1852. That was only 13 years ago. There was still hope. Back at Judith's house, Eleanor immediately began making plans. She needed to get to Riverside Plantation. Needed to speak with Robert Dillard. But she was exhausted. The journey, the stress, the confrontation with Blackwood, it had all taken its toll. She decided to rest for one day, then continue her search. That night, she wrote a letter to Samuel. She told him what she had learned, that Mary had been at Fairhope, that she had been sold to another plantation, that the search was continuing. She tried to sound hopeful, but she knew the odds were getting longer with each transfer, each year that passed. She sealed the letter and prepared it to be posted in the morning. Then she lay in bed and thought about Samuel waiting back in Charleston. Thought about Mary somewhere out there, if she was still alive. Thought about the cruelty of a system that could scatter lives like seeds in the wind. Eleanor had never considered herself a particularly brave person. She had lived a conventional life, married well, raised children, attended church, followed the social rules. But something had changed in her over the past weeks. Meeting Samuel, hearing his story, seeing the photograph of 2 people in love facing impossible odds. She had found a purpose, and she wasn't going to stop until she had answers. 2 days later, Eleanor hired another carriage to take her to Riverside Plantation. The journey took most of the morning, traveling along rough country roads that followed the Savannah River. The landscape was beautiful. Dense forests, rolling hills, the river glinting in the sunlight. But Eleanor couldn't enjoy it. Her stomach was tight with anxiety. This might be the end of the trail. Either Mary would be here or she would have been sold again, and the search would continue into an ever more distant past. Riverside was smaller than Fairhope, but no less prosperous looking. The main house was brick, 2 stories with a view of the river. Fields of cotton stretched in every direction. Eleanor could see enslaved people working in the distance, their figures small under the harsh sun. She approached the house and knocked. A young woman answered, her face wary. "I'm here to see Mr. Robert Dillard," Eleanor said. "Is he available?" "Who's asking?" "Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, I'm here on legal business regarding a property transaction." The young woman disappeared inside. Eleanor waited on the porch, watching the river flow past. After several minutes, a man emerged. Robert Dillard was perhaps 40 years old, lean and weathered, with sharp features and intelligent eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, not unkindly. "What brings you all the way out here?" Eleanor repeated her prepared story about settling her husband's estate. Dillard listened patiently, then invited her inside to his office. The room was cluttered with papers, ledgers, maps. A working man's office, not a showpiece. "You said this concerned a slave girl named Mary?" Dillard asked once they were seated. "Yes, I've traced her from Charleston to Savannah to Fairhope Plantation. Mr. Blackwood's records indicate he sold her to you in 1852. Dillard nodded slowly. "I remember that purchase. Young woman, early 20s, intelligent. I bought her as a house servant for my wife. She was having trouble managing the household staff." "Is she still here?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Dillard's expression shifted. Something like regret crossed his face. "No, she's not." Eleanor felt her heart sink. "Was she sold again?" "No," Dillard said quietly. "She died 3 years ago. Fever took her in the summer of 1854. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Dead. Mary was dead. She had been dead for 11 years. All this searching, all this hope. And it ended here, in this cluttered office, with this simple, terrible truth. "Are you certain?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm certain," Dillard said. "I remember it clearly. She was a good worker, kind to the other servants. My wife was fond of her. When the fever came through, we lost 7 people. Mary was one of them. She's buried in the servants' cemetery on the property." Eleanor closed her eyes. She needed to breathe, needed to think. Samuel had spent 7 years hoping, 7 years carrying that ring, 7 years believing Mary might still be out there. And now Eleanor would have to tell him that hope was dead. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Dillard's voice broke through her thoughts. "Are you all right? You've gone very pale." Eleanor opened her eyes. "I'm fine, just this is difficult news. For the legal case." Dillard stood and poured her a glass of water from a pitcher on his desk. Eleanor accepted it gratefully and drank. The cool liquid helped steady her. "Is there anything else you need to know?" Dillard asked. Eleanor thought of Samuel, of the photograph, of the ring, of the question he had never asked but must have thought about every day. Did she suffer? Was she alone? Did she remember me? When she died, Eleanor said carefully, Was anyone with her? Did she have friends here? Dillard looked surprised by the question. "Yes, actually. Mary was well liked. When she got sick, several of the other house servants cared for her, and my wife sat with her in the final hours. She didn't die alone." Eleanor felt tears well in her eyes. At least there was that. At least Mary hadn't been completely alone at the end. Did she ever speak of her life before? Her past? Dillard frowned, thinking. "Sometimes. She told my wife she had been married once. To a man named Samuel." She said he had been a good man, that he had tried to save her when they were separated. My wife got the impression Mary had never stopped loving him. Eleanor couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They spilled down her cheeks. Dillard looked alarmed. Mrs. Whitmore, I apologize, Eleanor said, wiping her face with her handkerchief. I've been traveling for days. The exhaustion is catching up with me. But it wasn't exhaustion, it was grief. Grief for Samuel. Grief for Mary. Grief for the life they should have had together and didn't. Grief for the cruelty of a world that could separate two people who loved each other and keep them apart until death. Could I see the cemetery? Eleanor asked. Where she's buried. For the records. Dillard hesitated, then nodded. Of course, I'll have someone show you. He called for a servant, an older man named Joseph, and instructed him to take Eleanor to the cemetery. Eleanor followed Joseph out of the house and across a field to a wooded area near the river. The cemetery was small, marked by simple wooden crosses and stones. Joseph showed her to a particular spot. This is Mary's place, he said. She was kind to me when I first came here. I was just a boy. She helped me learn how to serve at table without making mistakes. I was sad when she passed. Eleanor looked down at the grave. The wooden marker was weathered but still legible. Mary, died 1854. No last name, no age, just Mary. Thank you, Joseph, Eleanor said softly. Could I have a few minutes alone? Yes, ma'am. Joseph walked away, giving her privacy. Eleanor stood at the grave and thought about what to say. What do you say to a woman you never met but whose love story had become so important to you? What do you say to a ghost? I'm sorry, Eleanor whispered finally. I'm sorry this happened to you. I'm sorry you were separated from Samuel. I'm sorry you died alone, far from home, from the man who loved you. She paused, tears streaming down her face. But I want you to know he never forgot you. He's carried your ring for 7 years. He's never stopped loving you. And I'm going to tell him what happened. I'm going to tell him you never forgot him either. That's something, isn't it? That you both remembered. That the love survived even when nothing else did. She stayed there for a long time, standing in the shade of the trees, listening to the river flow past. Finally, she bent down and placed her hand on the earth above Mary's grave. Rest well, she whispered. You've earned it. When Eleanor returned to the house, Dillard was waiting on the porch. Did you find what you needed? He asked. Yes, Eleanor said. Thank you for your help. Dillard walked her to the carriage. Before she climbed in, he said, Mrs. Whitmore, can I ask you something? Of course. This wasn't really about a legal case, was it? Eleanor met his eyes. There was no point in lying now. No, it wasn't. Dillard nodded slowly. I thought not. No legal case would require this level of detail about one particular slave girl from 16 years ago. He paused. Whatever your real reason, I hope you found the answers you needed. I did, Eleanor said, though I wish the answers had been different. She climbed into the carriage and began the long journey back to Augusta. The landscape passed by, the same forest, the same river, the same cotton fields, but Eleanor saw none of it. She was thinking about Samuel, about how to tell him, about how he would react. She had promised him answers. She had found them. But sometimes answers were worse than not knowing. Sometimes hope, even false hope, was kinder than truth. By the time she reached Judith's house, she was exhausted. Judith took one look at her face and asked no questions, simply showed her to her room and let her rest. Eleanor lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to find the right words. How do you tell someone that the person they've been searching for is gone? How do you destroy hope? There were no right words. She would just have to tell him the truth, all of it, and let him decide what to do with it. That night, she wrote another letter to Samuel, but this time, she couldn't bring herself to include all the details. She simply wrote, "I have news. I'll be home in 3 days. Please prepare yourself." It was cowardly, perhaps, but she couldn't put those words, "Mary is dead," into writing. She needed to say them to his face. Needed to be there when he received the news. Needed to help him bear it. 3 days later, Eleanor's carriage pulled up in front of her house on Meeting Street. Samuel must have been watching from the window because he appeared at the door before she even climbed out. His face was drawn, anxious, hopeful, terrified, all at once. "Eleanor," he said, helping her down. "You're back. I got your letter. You found something." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I found something. Come inside. We need to talk." They went to the parlor. Samuel sat on the edge of the sofa, his hands clasped between his knees, his whole body tense. Eleanor sat across from him and took a breath. "I traced Mary's movements," she began, "from Charleston to Savannah to a plantation called Fairhope, to another plantation called Riverside." "Is she there?" Samuel interrupted. "At Riverside? Is she alive?" Eleanor looked at him, this young man who had suffered so much, who had hoped for so long, and she felt her heart break. "No, Samuel, she's not." Samuel's face went blank. "She was sold again?" "No," Eleanor said gently. "She died 11 years ago in 1854. She contracted a fever. She's buried at Riverside." For a long moment, Samuel didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even seem to breathe. Then slowly he stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the street. Eleanor waited. 11 years, Samuel said finally, his voice flat. "She's been dead for 11 years. "Yes." "I've been searching for a ghost." "You've been searching for the woman you loved," Eleanor corrected. "That's not the same thing." Samuel turned to face her. His eyes were dry, but there was something terrible in his expression. Something broken. "Did she suffer at the end?"